Welcome into Texans Today, everybody. I'm your host, Jeremy Chuggs, and coming up on today's program, I actually wanted to take a look at an interview that new Texan CJ Gardner-Johnson had this week. He was on the Pivot podcast with Ryan Clark and had some very interesting things to say about the trade from the Eagles to the Texans, about his former team, about his current team, and just kind of a deeper look at who CJ Gardner-Johnson is. And I thought it was a very interesting interview. I really, recommend after you watch this video, go check out the entire video. It's about an hour long. So I kind of give you the Cliff Notes synopsis version of that interview. But the question I wanted to ask before we get going, because I was kind of looking at this offseason as a whole, and I absolutely loved the move of trading Kenyon Green for CJ Gardner-Johnson, but was it the best move? Give me a true, give me a false. Was trading for CJ Gardner-Johnson the best move of the Texans offseason? I would argue yes, because you did two things. You shored up your secondary to have probably the best secondary in the entire National Football League, and then two, you got off of Kenyon Green, who was a bust. You selected him in round 1 out of Texas A&M, and I think the best thing for him was going to Philadelphia and going with maybe one of the best O-line coaches in Jeff Stoutland, because if he can't revitalize Kenyon Green's career, I don't think anybody can, and I don't think it was going to work out with the Houston Texans, so I think that was a win-win for this team. Now let's get into the interview and the highlights that I heard from that podcast. First up, he talked about what it was like to get traded, and I thought it was pretty interesting because us in the sports media, fans, we just think, oh yeah, guy gets traded, this, that, and the other. But, he kind of talked about how it was a roller coaster of emotions. He was stunned, upset, confused. He was getting calls from, Howie Roseman, the GM of the Philadelphia Eagles. He said Nick Caserio, Dom, who's their security guy on the sidelines, didn't take his calls, which is kind of weird in that moment. I understand maybe because you want to separate business just a little bit, but he was talking about how he was kind of upset and he didn't understand the fact that why they were trading him. He didn't get any of their reasoning of why. Then he talked about DeMeco Ryans calling him. He said when DeMeco Ryans first called him, he said he wasn't ready. DeMeco asked him like, hey, we're excited to have you down here. And Gardner-Johnson was kind of candid with him, was basically like, yo, I'm happy, but at the same time, I still have a lot of things to process, and there's a lot going through my head. And something that I've mentioned before, and having a head coach who's a former player, where CJ Gardner-Johnson said one of the best things for him is that DeMeco Ryans was like, yo, I understand. I get exactly what you're talking about, because funny enough, DeMeco Ryans was traded from the Texans to the Philadelphia Eagles. So kind of switcheroo in that situation, but he talked about having somebody who kind of understands the situation that he's going through and kind of how that helped him get to that next part of, getting over having to leave Philadelphia, which he said was tough on him and his family. He said his kid asked him and it kind of broke him up inside, does this mean we can't wear green anymore? And you kind of forget about all the kind of other factors when it comes to these guys. I know it's a game, but he's moving his entire family to a new city and kind of moving around, which I know a lot of y'all who probably watch these shows can relate to. A lot of Army brats out there who've had to move from station to station, having to move across the country. It's hard having to pick up and go, enroll your kids in a new school, find a new house, all those other things. Obviously, a little bit easier whenever you're a millionaire, but at the same time, talking about how it was tough for him to kind of get over the fact that he felt like he was kind of getting dumped by the Philadelphia Eagles. And kind of going along with that theme, the next highlight of this interview, which probably a lot of y'all have seen on Twitter, is his apology to his Philadelphia teammates, which I thought was the right thing to do. I liked his sentiment and kind of the fire that he had after he got traded, but I can see where he kind of felt a little bit of regret. Because after he was traded to the Texans, he basically came out and said, the Eagles aren't winning another one without me. I was the guy. They're not touching a Super Bowl without me. And he went on to kind of describe how with, the fact that he's not in Philadelphia anymore, he still has a connection with his teammates there. He still has a connection with A.J. Brown. He still has a connection with, Jalen Carter and with all those guys. So I think even with that, this is what he had to say after getting traded. The Eagles probably won't see a ring without me. Y'all saw what happened when I left. I'm popping now. I'm glad I'm in Texas. That's what CJ Gardner-Johnson said after getting traded from the Philadelphia Eagles. And I really do believe, the fact that he said this during the podcast after, going on that rant, talking about, how the Eagles aren't going to be successful without them. This is what he had to say. He said, I retract them, talking about the statements about his former team. And he said, I wouldn't even say it now because I played with those guys. I know how they would feel like, Chauncey, you're tripping. And went on to say, that's disrespectful to guys like a A.J. Brown, a Jalen Carter, and mentioned Lane Johnson, somebody who had actually won a Super Bowl before in 2017 with Nick Foles, and was like, honestly, it was kind of misplaced hate. It was misplaced towards my teammates in that he wasn't mad at his former teammates, obviously. Now, he didn't really clear things up with former DC Vic Fangio, who famously, I kind of showed you all these screenshots before talking about, how he was kind of calling out the Eagles front office, calling out Vic Fangio, saying it was kind of BS what they had done to him. He didn't really clear that up. He was more like, I'm sorry for saying what I did about my teammates and my former guys, guys who I went out onto the field with, went to war with. That's who he felt sorry for. But when it comes to Vic Fangio, doesn't seem like there was a lot of love lost in that situation. And the one thing that kind of struck me that he said was he thinks he was traded because the Eagles were scared of a competitor. They were scared of somebody who wasn't afraid to go against the grain, scared of somebody who wasn't afraid to cause a little bit of friction. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But I did find it a little bit interesting. I did like that he kind of retracted some of those statements about the Philadelphia Eagles because, it's kind of like move forward. That's your old team. You don't have to worry about your ex-girlfriend, unfollow her off of Instagram. You don't need to be, worrying about all that. But I did like how he kind of cleared the air a little bit. And he did end up, going to the Super Bowl ceremony with his teammates for winning the Super Bowl last year with the Philadelphia Eagles. Another kind of fun thing that he talked about in this interview was his mentor and what he learned, which I think, if he a little bit of Malcolm Jenkins rubbed off on him, that's an amazing thing. And it's kind of funny because he was his mentor, kind of replaced him in New Orleans, right? As CJ Gardner-Johnson was coming into his own, Malcolm Jenkins went to the Philadelphia Eagles. And then after Malcolm Jenkins left the Eagles, then CJ Gardner-Johnson kind of followed in his footsteps, went to the Philadelphia Eagles. And he talked about how much it meant having somebody who was as professional as Malcolm Jenkins, somebody who was as good of a mentor. Said, Malcolm Jenkins sat him down and he says, hey, I'm seeing through your BS. And he said, you were just like me, thinking you were on top of the world, but this is the NFL. You have to earn every single thing that comes to you in this league. And if you want to make it past your rookie contract, you got to do X, Y, and Z. Talked about, getting into the film room early, getting into the weight room early, all those things that can help you, catapult from being just a guy, a jag, into being a superstar in this league. And what I got was, there are a lot of off the field antics, him on Twitch, him talking, all this, that, and the other. But when it comes to ball, he's a professional. When it comes to the game of football, he takes it very seriously. And I think he came away a little bit misunderstood. He's a, kind of out there guy. He's a little kooky. He's a little, I'm not going to say crazy, but somebody who is a little different, right? And that's perfectly okay. I'm okay with that. And I think he is a little bit misunderstood in the media and on social media with everybody talking about CJ Gardner-Johnson. But talking about Malcolm Jenkins, it made me think, he talked about coming to the Texans and how they already have a great leadership core with this young group. They have a lot of young leaders in this locker room. So I'm going to ask you folks at home, who do you think are the top leaders in this Texans locker room right now? Let me know down in the comments section. Do you think it's C.J. Stroud? Maybe Will Anderson Jr.? Maybe some other veterans in that locker room because Stroud, Will Anderson, kind of part of the younger crowd. Let me know down in the comment section who you think the top leaders in this Texans locker room are. All right, next up from this CJ Gardner-Johnson interview, he talked about how special this Texans defense is, and he mentioned a couple guys out by name and how impressed he was with some of these guys, right? He talked about Jalen Pitre. He talked about, and called him a dog, said he's more of a linebacker, which we've kind of talked about. Jalen Pitre, not as much of a safety in this Texans defense, now kind of plays that hybrid linebacker role. The Texans run a 4-2-5, and Pitre's essentially a nickel guy slash a smaller version of a linebacker because he brings the boom. That's what he does. He called him a dog. He also mentioned Azeez Al-Shaair was a dog. He said that boy from Florida, really good linebacker for the Texans last year, is our clear linebacker one going into this season. And maybe the biggest shout out mention that he said in this interview was to his safety mate, Calen Bullock, the second-year man out of USC. He said, this dude is special. And that means something for CJ Gardner-Johnson, who's been around the league. He played with Malcolm Jenkins, played with the Philadelphia Eagles, played with the Detroit Lions. He's played with a lot of talented guys. And he went out of his way to say, the one dude I would say, if you're saying somebody who's going to break out this season, somebody who's going to be a household name, he said it was Calen Bullock. And Ryan Clark agreed with him. This is what he tweeted out after the interview. If you want to be early on the breakout star for the 2025 season, push all your chips to the middle of the table on Texan safety Calen Bullock. All-pro caliber talent who is working on the little things daily, will be one of the league's elite ball hawks. Texans secondary is loaded. And that's great to hear. We've been talking about how the Texans have the best secondary in the entire National Football League after adding CJ Gardner-Johnson to a guy like Calen Bullock going into his second year. And it's good to hear that wasn't just a fluke, that guys who have been around the league, guys who know ball, are taking notice and saying, hey, this dude is special. Which, as a Texans fan, got to make you feel pretty good, right? Got to make you feel pretty good. And the last thing from this interview was his vision for the Texans. He mentioned, wanting to play for a championship caliber team. That was the one thing, because he was mentioned, Eagles kind of told him that he was going to be traded before he knew what team it was going to be. And he said, please do not send me anywhere that's bad. Please send me to a contender. Please send me to somebody who's good. I can't do it to myself playing for a bad team this year. Because, he's still on the right side of 30, has a lot left in the tank. And talked about how he was grateful that he ended up trading to the Texans. And kind of echoing his opening presser where he said championship or nothing, he, meaning DeMeco Ryans, didn't bring me here to win no division or no conference. He talked about this team being ready to win it all this season, and that absolutely has me fired up for this Texans 2025 season, because I think this defense is something special. We really could be seeing the best Texans defense of all time, and that's crazy considering we had a guy by the name of J.J. Watt, who many consider maybe one of the best defensive linemen of all time. So the fact that this defense can maybe surpass some of those defenses and be the best in the NFL gives us a really good shot to contend with some of the biggest teams in the AFC. That's all I have for you on today's show, folks. If you want to hit me up on social media, you can do so at Jeremy Chugs on X. On IG, I'm at Texans Today CS. And on TikTok, I'm also at Jeremy Chugs. My DMs are always open.